the other. His heaving increased, and he stopped rolling. He lay flat on his back, staring at the sky. His eyes were fixed on something, and his legs vibrated and stopped. His hands did the same, and then finally his fingers. But his eyes remained open, transfixed on the top of the forest. "Let's pick him up." Alhaji's voice was shaking. I put Gassimu's arm around my neck. Alhaji did the same, and we walked with him, his feet dragging on the ground. His arms were cold, his body was still sweating, and he continued bleeding. We didn't say a word to each other. We all knew what had happened. When we finally got to the wali, Gassimu's eyes were still open. Alhaji closed them. I sat by him. His blood was on my palm and my wrist. I regretted hitting him with the pestle. The dry blood was still in his nose. I began to cry softly. I couldn't cry as much as I wanted to. The sun was getting ready to leave the sky. It had come out to take Gassimu with it. I just sat by him, unable to think. My face began to harden. When the breeze blew against it, I felt how my flesh resisted enjoying the cool wind. All through the night, no sleep came to me. My eyes watered and dried over and over again. I did not know what to say. For a few minutes, I tried to imagine what it felt like for Gassimu when his fingers vibrated to let the last air out of his body. Chapter 12. We must have been walking for days. I do not really remember. When suddenly 2 men put us at gunpoint and motioned with their guns for us to come closer. We walked in between 2 rows of men carrying machine guns, AK-47s, G3s, and RPGs. Their faces were dark, as if they had bathed them in charcoal, and they stared intensely at us with their extremely red eyes. When we got to the back of the line, there were 4 men lying on the ground, their uniforms soaked with blood. One of them lay on his stomach, and his eyes were wide open and still. His insides were spilling onto the ground. I turned away, and my eyes caught the smashed head of another man. Something inside his brain was still pulsating, and he was breathing. I felt nauseated. Everything began to spin around me. One of the soldiers was looking at me, chewing something and smiling. He took a drink from his water bottle and threw the remaining water at my face. "You will get used to it. Everybody does eventually," he said. Gunshots erupted nearby, and the soldiers began to move, taking the 6 of us with them. We came upon a river where the soldiers' aluminum boats with motors gently floated. We saw bodies of 11 and 13-year-old boys in army shorts piled by the river. We turned our faces away. The gunshots were getting louder. As we climbed into the boats, an RPG flew from the bushes, exploding on the shore. The top of the river was boiling. A man in army trousers came running down the path toward the boats, shooting at the soldiers. One of the men in my boat opened fire, dropping the man on the ground. The boats headed downstream, and we were let off near a tributary. A soldier led us to Yele, a village that was occupied by the military. It was a big village with more than 10 houses. The soldiers occupied most of them. They had cut down the bush around the village except for the entrance from the river, through which we arrived. This way, the soldiers explained to us, it would be difficult for the enemy to attack. In the beginning, it seemed we had finally found safety at Yele. The village was always full of lively chattering and laughter. The adults, civilians, and soldiers spoke about the weather, planting seasons, hunting, and nothing about the war. At first, we couldn't understand why people behaved this way. But gradually, the smiles on people's faces assured us that there was nothing to worry about anymore. All that darkened the mood of the village was the sight of orphaned children. There were over 30 boys between the ages of 7 and 16. I was one of them. Apart from this, there were no indications that our childhood was threatened, much less that we would be robbed of it. We stayed in a big, unfinished cement brick house along with other boys. A large green tarp served as its roof, and we slept on the cement floor on tiny blankets that two people shared. The soldiers set up their garrison in another unfinished brick house, and there they socialized, separate from the civilians. In the evenings, they watched movies, played music, laughed, and smoked marijuana. The smell of it covered the entire village. During the day, they mingled with the civilians, and we helped in the kitchen. Kanai and I fetched water and washed dishes. The rest of our friends helped by chopping eggplants, onions, meat, and the like in the kitchen. I liked busying myself with work all day, going back and forth to the river and continuously washing dishes. It was the only way I could distract myself from the thoughts that were giving me severe headaches. But by midday, all the daily chores were done. The evening meal was prepared and only awaited consumption. Everyone sat on the verandas of the houses facing the village square. Parents picked their children's hair, girls played singing and clapping games, and some of the young soldiers played soccer with the boys. Their jubilation and clapping could be heard far down the river. Life was not lived in fear during the day in this village. The soccer games reminded me of the league matches I used to play in when my family first moved to the mining town of Mogbiwimo. In particular, I remembered a final match that my team, which consisted of Junior and some friends, won. Both my parents were at the game, and at the end, my mother applauded and smiled widely, her face glowing with pride. My father walked up to me and rubbed my head before he held my right hand and raised it up as he declared me his champion. He did the same to Junior. My mother brought us a cup of water, and as we drank, she fanned us with her headcloth. The excitement caused my heart to pound faster, and I was sweating profusely. I could taste the salty sweat that ran from my forehead to my lips. Standing there with my family, I felt light, as if I were getting ready to fly. I wanted to hold the moment longer, not only to celebrate our victory, but because the smile on my parents' face that evening made me so happy that I felt every nerve in my body had awoken and swayed to the gentlest wind that sailed within me. I distanced myself from games in the village and sat behind houses, staring into the open space until my migraines temporarily subsided. I didn't tell anyone what was happening to me. My symptoms weren't mentioned in the morning when the sergeant doctor, as the civilians called him, lined up children and families for treatment. The sergeant doctor called for fever, cold, and many other illnesses, but he never asked if anyone was having nightmares or migraines. At night, Alhaji, Juma, Moriba, and Kanai played marbles on the cement floor under the moonlight that made its way through the open window panes. Musa had grown popular among the boys and would always end the night with a different story. I quietly sat in the corner of the room, clenching my teeth, as I didn't want to show my friends the pain I felt from my headache. In my mind's eye, I would see sparks of flame, flashes of scenes I had witnessed, and the agonizing voices of children and women would come alive in my head. I cried quietly as my head beat like the clapper of a bell. Sometimes, after the migraine had stopped, I was able to fall asleep briefly, only to be awoken by nightmares. One night I dreamt that I was shot in the head. I was lying in my blood as people hurriedly walked past me. A dog came by and began licking my blood ferociously. The dog bared its teeth as my blood sweetened its mouth. I wanted to scare it away, but I was unable to move. I woke up before it started what I was afraid it was going to do to me. I was sweating and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. One morning, the atmosphere in the village suddenly became tense. It wasn't clear what had caused the change, but something was about to happen. All the soldiers assembled at the village square, dressed in their uniforms, carrying their weapons and ammunition in backpacks and waist belts. Their bayonets hung by the sides of their army trousers as they stood still, with their helmets underneath their arms. "Attention! At ease. Attention. At ease. I heard the voice of the drill instructor as I walked to the river with Alhaji to fetch water. When we returned, the drill instructor had stopped warming up the soldiers. Instead, Lieutenant Jabari stood in front of his men, his hands crossed behind his back. He addressed them for hours before they were released for lunch. While the lieutenant was talking to his men, we quietly went about our daily chores and at the same time tried to eavesdrop on what he was saying. But in order to hear him, we would have had to get closer and join the line of soldiers, which was out of the question. We walked about all day quietly speculating about what the lieutenant could have told his men. In the evening, the soldiers cleaned their guns, sometimes firing a couple of rounds into the air. These random gunshots sent the younger children diving between the legs of their parents. The soldiers smoked cigarettes and marijuana, some sat alone, while others gambled and joked with one another into the night. Some watched a movie under one of their big tents. Lieutenant Jabari sat on the veranda of his house and read a book. He would not look up, not even when his men whistled loudly at the size and sophistication of a gun in the war movie they were watching. He looked up only when it was quiet. He caught me looking at him and called me to sit with him. He was a tall man with barely any hair. His eyes were big and they complemented his full cheekbones, which looked as if he had something in his mouth. He was a quiet individual, but his quietness had a forceful authority that all his men feared and respected. His face was so dark that it took courage to have any eye contact with him. "Are you getting enough to eat here?" he asked. "Yes," I said, as I tried to look at what he was reading. "It is Shakespeare." He showed me the cover. "Julius Caesar. Have you heard of it?" "I read Julius Caesar in school," I told him. "Do you remember any of it?" he asked. "Cowards die many times before their deaths," I began, and he recited the whole speech with me. As soon as we were done, his face resumed its sternness. He ignored me and seemed to delve into his book. I watched as the veins on his forehead became transparent through his flesh and disappeared as he absorbed the contents of the book or thought about whatever else was on his mind. I tiptoed away from him as the sky exchanged sunlight for darkness. When I was 7, I used to go to the town square to recite monologues from the works of Shakespeare for the adults of my community. At the end of every week, the male adults would gather to discuss matters of the community. They sat on long wooden benches, and at the end of their discussions I would be called upon to recite Shakespeare. My father would cough loudly to alert the other adults to be silent so that I could start. He sat in the front, with his arms crossed and a big smile on his face that looked as if it would take years to fade away. I stood on a bench and held on to a long stick as my sword. I would then start with Julius Caesar. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." I always recited speeches from Macbeth and Julius Caesar, as those were the adults' favorites. I was always eager and excited to read for them, because it made me feel that I was really good at speaking the English language. I was awake when the soldiers left in the middle of the night, the echo of their marching leaving an eerie air about the village that continued until dawn and through the rest of the day. There were 10 soldiers left behind to protect the village, and they stood at their posts all day. Just when the evening was waving its fingers, signaling night to approach, the soldiers issued a curfew by shooting a few rounds into the air and ordering everyone to get inside and stay low to the ground. That night Musa told no stories, and Moriba didn't play marbles with the other boys. We quietly sat against the wall listening to the rapid bursts of gunfire in the distance. Just before the last hours of night, the moon sailed through the clouds, showing its face through the open window of the building before it was driven away by a cockcrow.